Hello, I'm Sophia Besch, and this is the World Unpacked.
Hi, I'm Chung Lee, Senior Fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I'm here with my great friend,
Darcie Draudt, Fellow for Korea Studies here at Carnegie Endowment.
So, Darcie, as you know, I've just come back from Seoul. I'm based in Seoul, but I work on a number of issues here at Carnegie. And the Korean political scene, of course, is shifting on a daily basis. President Yoon Suk Yeol's last testimony in the impeachment hearings in the Constitutional Court, I think just ended today. And so there will be some type of a sentence in the coming weeks, I assume. And if that happens, we'll have new elections within 60 days. So come June or July, there will be most likely a new Korean government. There's a very slim chance that he won't be impeached and be put back into office. That will create even another political scene in Korea. At the same time, however, there's a new government here in Washington with the Trump administration. So I think in that sense, both Korea and the U.S. are dealing with very different political dynamics.
Very different domestic political dynamics, but it's also putting a lot of pressure, I think, on the need or the timeline for how to deal with our bilateral relations. So I'm wondering, I mean, I've seen a lot of our Korean friends come through town the past few weeks since Trump has come into office. But what's the feeling like in Seoul among, let's say, the political set, the political elites, whether diplomats or the business leaders? You know, what's the feeling right now about the new American administration?
You know, that's a great question. First of all, it's too early days in many respects.
Sure, of course.
But I think what we've seen in the first months or so of the Trump administration is what they've said and done vis-a-vis NATO.
Okay.
And so if you listen to Korean experts or Japanese experts as I have or others, there isn't all that much that's been said by the Trump administration on quote unquote their big, mega Asia policy. So Prime Minister Modi came to the White House, and so forth, and the Prime Minister of Japan came to the White House, but there's no overarching blueprint yet. And I think one key telltale sign is if you look at the Munich Security Conference and what the Vice President said and the Secretary of Defense and others have said, that really caused alarm bells in certain respects. And so we'll wait and see exactly what the Trump administration have to say about Japan, about Korea, about the Philippines, Taiwan, and the list goes on. But that is one very worrying early day signal. I hope, however, that the president realizes the net value of having really advanced allies like the Japanese and the Koreans on their side in the great, U.S.-China strategic rivalry.
There's a lot in there, actually. So let me pose a few different things that I've been hearing around town here, particularly as it pertains to not just American alliances general, because right now we do see a shift in how Trump is handling NATO, but more specifically as it's pertaining to the Asia Pacific, because I've heard a few different theories. The first one is, and this is a question about what is a Trump alliance strategy. Now, first of all, I mean, we've had for example, former National Security Advisor John Bolton said Trump doesn't even believe in alliances. So there's that kind of very basics. Okay,
basic.
So that's the first one. The second theory of a strategy is, well, the lessons that we're learning about how he's exactly what you lined out. Backing off from some of our general NATO commitments over the past 30 plus years. That forebodes poorly for our network of alliances in Asia, particularly Korea and Japan. And those are different. I think they might come under different crosshairs, but certainly they're definitely to be asked to be maybe not on the chopping block, but to be scrutinized by the Trump administration. The third theory that I've heard is that Trump is seeking to move back from Europe to enter more assertively into the Pacific theater in a way that would be to counter a Chinese as adversary. So that might presage actually building out some of the more traditional alliances that we have in the region. And I've heard that line from some of the people who are close to the Trump administration. That's potentially their pet theory, and whether that has to do with a Taiwan issue, whether that has to do with America's vision in the world and spheres of influence, that's another thing. So I've seen those theories. How do you make what do you make of those?
At the most basic level, as you and I both know as poli-sci majors, alliances are formed because you either have a common adversary or shared values.
Yeah.
And in our case, in the U.S.-ROC relationship or the U.S.-Japan alliance, it's a combination of both. You have a common adversary, whether it's the DPRK or maybe even China to a certain extent, or even Russia these days. But you also have shared common values and interests. And those three converging points are all shifting. What I think the Trump administration is doing in its early days, it's sending a message to all allies across the world that business as usual is finished. Now, from a NATO perspective, I think that message was received at very different angles. But at the same time, 10 years ago, 75% of NATO's combined defense spending was borne by the US. So it is true that our European friends did not really pick up the defense mantle for the last 25 years. So Trump is telling our European allies, buckle up because we're not going to pay for your defense. That message is loud and clear. On the Asian side, the Japanese are increasing defense spending, so are the Koreans, so are the Taiwanese, and even ASEAN partners like the Philippines, right? But what I worry about, Darcie, is in one of the theories that you mentioned, one of the rationale for shifting attention is to make sure that more resources go from Europe to Asia. Okay, I can understand some rationale, but number one, power does not transfer so easily from one theater to another.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean that just because you lessen commitments in NATO Europe, suddenly your presence in East Asia goes up exponentially.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Number one, it'll be a long process. It'll be a drawn-out process. And in the meantime, the Chinese are going to see huge holes in America's commitments. And I think the final point is, regardless of how the Trump administration looks at the alliances, particularly in the East Asian theater, you've got to really ask yourself, you have two of the most advanced, technologically advanced economies, the Japanese and South Koreans. You want to make sure that they're on your side. Because if the rationale is to constrain or even contain China, what better tools do you have in your toolbox than to have two allies who are not only aligned with you strategically, militarily, and diplomatically, but are also two of the world's most advanced manufacturing powers, including shipbuilding. And that's the message that I think Koreans and the Japanese want to hear from the Trump folks. So we'll see how that pans out.
Yeah, your point about shifting, like if that third theory that I outlined is at least partially true, shifting from Europe and the Middle East to a more Asia, really a Pacific-centered force posture on the part of the U.S., it is a qualitatively different theater, right? And you hit the nail on the head in that it requires large amount of shipbuilding capabilities. It's a naval heavy theater, right? So how do you see that playing as far as timelines are concerned, number one, and then number two, how is that going to be affected? Let's focus on Korea in particular.
Okay. So if you look at it from that way, you have the so-called first island chain and the second island chain. And the Chinese now have enough military capabilities, whether it's hypersonic missiles or anti-ship missiles or whatever, to basically entangle the U.S. across the first island chain. And they're building capacity to contest American supremacy into the second island chains. So yes, I get the rationale why the Indo-Pacific is a critically emerging theater for the U.S. and other powers here in Asia. But again, if you look at the entire geopolitical landmass, the Eurasian landmass from Russia and the middle Iran, China, and North Korea are now united. And the way that the U.S. was able to maintain this global balance of power over the last 50 plus years was to have a strong west end of the Eurasian landmass with NATO and a strong east end with the Japanese and Koreans. And that was a successful strategy. It was a pincer strategy to kind of constrain the Russians and the Chinese. And of course, the world has changed tremendously since then. But if you want to make sure that that Eurasian authoritarian partnership or coalition becomes weaker, you need a strong NATO and you need a strong alliance here. It's not an either or proposition, right? But you're absolutely right. The maritime theater in Asia is very different from the landmass theater in Europe. You talk to the Finns or the Swedes with their long borders, you need ground forces, troops on the ground, boots on the ground. Whereas here in Asia, you need more ships, you need more subs, you need more air power, which America has, but not to the extent that you need to make sure that you counter so-called Chinese or growing Chinese A2AD capabilities. So there you are. I mean, you're absolutely right. But as I said, it's not an either or proposition. You've got to have the capacity to basically constrain Russia and China to the extent that this administration feels the need to do so. And I think the best way to do that is to have really compelling alliances.
Arguably, though, the Trump administration is taking doesn't have that view of the world, right? I mean, it's very clear just even the past week, maybe 2 weeks, the sorts of, let's say, Trump-Putin interactions are showing that it doesn't want it. This administration does not see that vision of America's presence in the world, that the kind of pincer strategy or encirclement or however we're going to tell it, that's no longer the American interest right now. And so, if the tactic is no longer fitting, the strategy isn't there, then that tactic is no longer
you're
necessary.
Absolutely right. And I think this is why, whether it's President Macron or the new Chancellor of Germany or the UK, as the case may be, they've got to come up with Plan B. And Plan B is, how is NATO going to really ramp up defense spending at a time when Europe's economic growth is really slowing? Like all other advanced economies, the Japanese economy, the Korean economy, all of these economies are aging. Their population is dropping. The birth rate is falling. And social welfare spending is skyrocketing. So at a time when all of these domestic demands are increasing, you have to really also increase defense spending. And that's a very politically hard choice for Europeans to make. But they've got to make that decision. But you're right. Insofar as the second Trump administration is concerned, if Europe doesn't pick up the slack, then the US is out. It's very simple. And so the lesson for Asian allies, I think, is, all right, if you want us to become greater partners, then maybe the Trump administration will say, I want South Korea to renegotiate the SMA agreement. We want you to pay much more than, let's say, $1 billion plus that you pay us per year. We also want you to pick up the slack in terms of supporting U.S. forces throughout the Pacific theater, as the case may be. And so there will be demands, but I think those demands will be met until a new government in Korea emerges. So we have to wait until somebody is able to call the shots in Seoul.
I do think that there's a lot of really important lessons that I'm sure the Koreans are seeking to draw from how Trump is interacting with Ukraine in particular, right? So what is, and for me, my studies of this, it starts to look kind of scary. What are you hearing in Seoul right now? What are the concerns that we're seeing when Trump is, calling Zelensky a dictator, or when Trump is saying Zelensky is the one who started the war? What lessons are Koreans right now thinking about
as you
that?
know, Darcie, as somebody who knows Korea intimately, you studied there, you have tons of friends, and you're one of the rising stars in Korean studies. But in 1950, in a very different place in the world, the Korean War broke out. And the U.S. sent the largest contingent of troops, and so did 18 other countries. So the only reason why the ROK was saved from total defeat was because the UN forces came to our defense. Now, of course, Ukraine is totally different. and because they've done all the fighting themselves with, huge support from the U.S. and other NATO allies. But if the Ukrainian war ends, as the Trump administration wants, primarily on Russian terms, like, for example, no membership in NATO, the fact that you would have a very, very small Ukrainian force, all the territory that Russia has gotten illegally, beginning with the Crimean Peninsula, it's theirs. And then you have to ask yourself, if you're a Korean or Japanese and you wake up to this new reality, you're going to say, well, heaven forbid if there is a second Korean War or another major North Korean infiltration or operation or whatever, can we count on our American friends to come fight with us? And that's a question that I think Koreans are asking themselves. And this is why, unfortunately, 70% of South Koreans believe that at some point in time, it might make sense for the South Koreans to have their own nuclear force. Now, I believe that that is not the right answer because that has huge opportunity costs and there's no political consensus, but it is basically triggering lots of questions that we did not ask before.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm worried here. And again, I mean, I've been sitting in Washington. I haven't been in Seoul in the past few months, but I'm worried that, let me put it this way, the theme word, the key words in this broader alliance question is one of trust and belief in commitment, belief in America's commitment to extended deterrence toward North Korea. I mean, that's I think at the heart of this South Korea's questions about pursuing its own nuclear capability. And so it's really worrisome to think that, in a sense, we might be taking that trust for granted.
One of the great things that happened, I think, during President Yoon's time in office and with the Biden administration was the fact that they created this nuclear consultative group, so that at least the Koreans and the Americans were talking in much more in-depth on nuclear issues. It doesn't mean that there is a coterminous, sharing of nuclear weapons. That has never happened either in NATO or elsewhere. But now South Koreans are wondering, how credible is American extended deterrence under the second Trump administration? Now, so far, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State have all said that alliances are critical, at least in this part of the world, and that our commitments to the defense of Japan and Korea remain unchanged. But as I said, we haven't seen exactly what approaches the President Trump will take vis-a-vis Kim Jong-un, or what type of a nuclear deal he may do with the DPRK. So again, we've got to cross that bridge when the day comes, but I think Koreans are really concerned that if there is a negotiated settlement over the North Korean nuclear issue that basically skips over the ROK and Japan, for example, there will be lots of angst in Seoul. Yeah.
Yes, one thing that I've been puzzling through, and a lot of this is like path dependent or process oriented, is the question of how the Trump administration is going to approach the Korean Peninsula as a whole. Is it going to problematize? There's not an answer to this because this has yet to happen, but is it going to see, right? So I see the Trump administration has kind of two major issues that it's concerned about with the Korean Peninsula. If we start in the north, it's some sort of nuclear deal. I think it's unclear what that means for the Trump administration. Longstanding American policy has been complete, verified denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I'm not sure what a nuclear deal would look like for Trump particularly. It might be something less than that. In pursuit of just getting a deal, maybe it's a poor deal, but it still is a deal with Kim Jong-un, right? I could see him wanting to go back to the table after feeling burned, both sides feeling burned in Hanoi. So that's the North Korea component. Maybe that happens first. The other one is South Korea, and this is something that's not really been an issue of alliance management historically, is the trade imbalance. That's the issue for Trump when it comes to South Korea. So that's very different than historically when we think about alliance management between the United States and South Korea. It's more, honestly, like more wonky alliance issues, not even burden sharing in the way that Trump is problematizing it, like how much is Korea paying, but what does our force posture look like, or what basing looks like on the peninsula. It's much, I think, wonkier issues traditionally. But the administration now, as we know, is very much economically focused, very much interested in bilateral deals. And the metric that the Trump administration uses a lot of across the board is trade imbalance. We've seen that with Mexico and Canada, right? And the deals that have been kind of, trotted out in those cases. But I think the Koreans are very right to be fearful that that's what's going to, the Trump administration will combat, because it is quite a large trade imbalance. So maybe that's the one that Trump goes first. But depending on which one he tackles first, his administration has very severe implications for solving the other side of this.
That's very, very true. But the bad news is we know exactly what they want, and the good news is we know exactly what they want.
Okay.
So let's tackle North Korea first. So CVID, complete, verifiable, denuclearization, is not really going to happen. I think what Trump wants is he wants to go back to Hanoi in his own mindset and say, look, I almost had a deal.
Sure. Yeah.
But I was convinced, but I was pushed by my advisors not to take the deal. And I think the best we can basically imagine is there will be a nuclear freeze, quote unquote, no more nuclear tests, and also no more ICBM tests. Will that make a huge difference? Marginally, it'll make a difference, but not all that much, because since Trump won, North Korea's nuclear capabilities have grown exponentially. And so they're on the verge of operationalizing tactical nuclear weapons on submarines, SLBMs.
Yeah.
And that will be a game changer, because it will give the US and the Koreans like zero early warning, because they'll be off the coast of Incheon, loaded with nuclear weapons. But as far as Trump is concerned, as long as I have a deal, I solve the nuclear issue, then basically I can go home scot-free. So that's number one. On the trade imbalance, I'm a little bit more, I guess, how can I put it, positive, because this puts the Korean companies in the forefront of US ROK relations almost for the first time. In other words, if you look at the last 10 years, one of the critical figures is the growth in Korean direct investment in the US.
Yeah, that's right.
So we have Korean car companies, in Alabama, in Georgia. We have Korean companies in Texas, Samsung, and the list goes on, in Michigan. In virtually every major critical U.S. state, there are Korean companies investing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. So if the new Korean government really wants to take a preemptive action on this point, they really want to say, okay, we will invest heavily in the U.S. That, I think, is the best way to show the Trump administration that the South Koreans, are willing to be a crucial economic partner of the U.S.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, that's where I think we're headed.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more we can talk about later on about the industrial side of this. But let's tie a bow on the North Korea question, because I do want to get back to the Russia role in this, right? Because it's not only that Kim Jong-un has succeeded in, one, closing his borders. I mean, COVID probably did more for anything than than sanctions, right? Developed a nuclear capability since Trump first took office, 2016. It's pretty credible now. But it also now has this close relationship with Russia, given North Korea's assistance in Ukraine, right? North Korea has sent, we know now that North Korea has, though initially denied it, North Korea sent soldiers on the front lines to make up for Putin's shortcomings when it comes to the personnel. But it's going to factor in later on. And, so how are we going to piece that part of this puzzle together?
There are between 12 to 14,000 North Korean troops in Russia fighting against Ukraine. Now, when the Ukrainian war is over at some point in time, those forces, of course, will be withdrawn. What Kim Jong-un wanted from that deal was he wants advanced fighters from the Russians and advanced technologies for military satellites. I don't think Putin's going to give those to Kim Jong-un.
Right.
So, and Kim Jong-un also wanted some leverage vis-a-vis China because North Korea is so dependent on the Chinese, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, when the Ukrainian war ends, I think the Russian-North Korean partnership, for what it's worth, there really isn't much there. Because once the North Korean troops come back, the biggest dividend is they'll get combat experience, especially in fighting drones. But other than that, there really isn't much that the North Koreans are getting. So they're back to square one. However, there is a side effect to all this, and which is, how can the South Korean intelligence community really work with the U.S. when the American government is in many respects aligned in some respects with Russia? So you have to ask yourself, if you're a Japanese intelligence officer, a South Korean intelligence specialist, and you're sitting in the same room with an American counterpart, and you're talking about regional global issues.
Interesting.
And maybe there's a meeting of the minds on North Korean threat or the Chinese threat. But if the American intelligence officer or policymaker says, well, as far as Russia is concerned, we have a very different view, that's going to place a very different burden on Korean and Japanese intelligence officials, because we have been, for the last 50 years, reading from the same sheet of music as far as Russia is concerned.
Yeah.
So there is that side effect, which we haven't yet crossed, but that's something that does concern me over the next several months and years.
It's a tough question. Let's take a quick break, and we'll pick up on some of the South Korea alliance questions, including the industrial component of this, I think.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
Thanks for listening to the World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show.
Great. So in the first half, we talked about some big
Sure.
global geopolitical questions, but I think it's really important for us to talk about the different aspects of the South Korea-U.S. relationship that maybe aren't necessarily getting as much due or haven't been, but that we work on here at Carnegie pretty closely. And that's, I think, in the economic domain and the tech domain. What are some of the things that right now that you think, you talked a little bit earlier about Korean investment in the United States, and we're certainly seeing that. I mean, I've been following really closely, for example, the state of Georgia has been extremely successful at attracting Korean investment. So some of this has to do with the IRA, the Biden administration IRA, but not exclusively. This is what's really, I think, interesting. My, political science hat comes on, and I'm interested now in the federal system, how that's impacting our alliance. The state of Georgia did a lot at the state level to attract Korean investments. So we even had like a director of Korean investment position in Atlanta, which is really, I think, one, it's incredible that there was that specific thing. And two, it says the nature and the value of Korean investment. So we saw billions of dollars from Hyundai building its meta plant, everything from the vehicles to the batteries. So it's really an ecosystem of building EVs, batteries, things that are all, that are injecting thousands of jobs into Georgia, or supposed to. All these are supposed to come online this year. So that's just one example, I think, of the kinds of how Korean corporations are another part of understanding our relationship. And it's importantly, too, not only at the national level, but two, I think this also speaks to, one, Trump administration's interest in rebuilding America, the America first, bringing manufacturing back home. But two, it is having some state level and local effects, high ROI in areas that we wouldn't necessarily see otherwise.
You're absolutely right. 20 years ago, it would have been almost impossible to imagine that a Korean company or a slew of Korean companies would invest tens of billions of dollars in the U.S., but that's happening as we speak. Darcie, you have a really great point. I know that you're going to write a book, or you're working on a book, on the role of Korean corporations in the making of Korea's foreign policy. And that's another key facet of Korean foreign policy that is relatively new. Korean companies like Samsung, SK Hynix, now Hanwha, LG, Hyundai, and the list goes on, have always been very globalized, but they've never really been at the forefront of so-called supply chains. But now that's basically the case, right? I think there are three facets to your great question. And the first is, if you look at the AI revolution that's happening across all markets and countries, it does make sense for the Americans and the Koreans and the Japanese to collaborate on AI-driven research. So South Korea, if you look at the per capita R&D investment, it's one of the highest in the world.
Yes, it's
so,
second highest.
Right?
Only
So
after
if you look at
Israel.
it that way, if we're able to combine American, prowess on R&D with the Koreans and the Japanese, you will have a huge AI triangle.
Okay.
And that basically is something that's really long term. Number two, on the more here and now, we talked about maritime strategy earlier. Korea is one of the world's top shipbuilders.
Yep.
And so if we're able to come up with a different, a U.S. legislation that goes above and beyond the Jones Act, and if the Koreans are able to work with American shipbuilders in building faster ships, that will also complement American strategy in the new maritime domain. And then the other thing is, of course, I would argue, I know nothing about this, but if you look at our societies, biopharma is going to be enormous because American society is aging, but Japanese and Korean society are super fast aging societies. And so if you have biopharma as the next big thing, and I think it is, that's another enormous potential for both direct investment in the U.S. and collaborative R&D. And so if you put all that together, you have what? Not just a military alliance and a diplomatic political alliance, you have now a technology alliance that is just beyond, it goes beyond building plants in like Georgia or Texas.
Exactly.
So if we are able to do that, and the other key plus is this, Darcie, I think on average, every single year, there are like 50,000 Korean students still studying in the U.S. Now, it was a lot higher before COVID.
Yeah.
It was up to about 60,000. Interestingly, 5 years ago, the number of Korean students studying in the U.S. and China was about equal, 60,000 to 60,000. After COVID and all of the issues we've had with the Chinese, the number of Korean students studying in China has dropped enormously, whereas those studying the U.S. has remained relatively unchanged. What does that tell you? It tells you that at least on higher education, there is an intensive cooperative network between Koreans and Americans that doesn't even exist between Japan and the U.S. because most Japanese like to study within their countries, which is fine. But for Koreans, as you well know, studying in the U.S. is still considered to be a very, very critical threshold.
Yeah.
And if we're able to combine all of that, I hope we will be able to build a new technology alliance that goes beyond the military domain.
That's really, I like this. I like thinking about the high level of student here.
Right.
I don't know if these numbers are still current, but the number one and number two sending countries of foreign students in the U.S. are China and India, and 3 is South Korea.
Right.
That's incredible considering India and China have over 1 billion people, and Korea about 50 million.
Right.
That South Korea is still the third highest sender of foreign students.
And the number of Chinese students studying in the U.S. has dropped dramatically.
There's a lot of factors. Yeah,
right?
there's a lot of factors involved in that.
And I think even Indian students, the numbers are likely to drop a little bit because of visa issues or whatever. But for many Koreans, they study the US, but many of them also choose to go back.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? But people really don't understand why that's important. It's because those students who become leaders over time in various fields
That's right.
are the ones who maintain, quote unquote, the alliance on a
That's
daily
right.
basis.
That's right.
You know, whether it's in media or fashion or
That's
food
right.
or whatever endeavor
That's
they're
right,
in.
yeah.
And that's what makes the relationship very special. And, you know, we send students to other parts of Asia, students to Europe, but still the mecca for higher education for Korean students still remains
Yeah.
the US. And I think that is a huge magnet and a huge plus for the alliance.
You know, it gets to some of the like kind of softer side of the alliance that we don't necessarily think about because traditionally when we talk about alliance management, because Korean culture and American culture historically
Are so different.
is so different.
Yeah.
I mean, everything
Yeah.
from, whether we talk about it like in kind of maybe stereotypes, individualistic
Right,
versus,
right.
Group oriented or whatever.
Right.
All of that stuff aside, the fact that one, there's the cultural familiarity
Right.
on both sides, and we're also seeing an increase of Americans studying
Sure.
in Korea.
Yeah.
Certainly, number one, I'm one of them. But number two, it also means that they're speaking the same technical
Yeah.
language too, right? So even if it's not necessarily in the diplomatic domain, when we're talking about students that go in STEM, that go in these R&D, that could be doing the
Right.
cooperative, R&D endeavors, or in biopharm, whatever it is, the fact that they're not only able to speak the same language, English, but also the same know-how, the same, all of that stuff that actually does breed dividends for
You know,
working
I was
relationships.
talking to a very close friend of mine who works at one of the big high-tech firms in Korea, and he was lamenting that almost all of the top AI graduates at top Korean universities are picked up by Silicon Valley companies
To go to the U.S.
to go to the U.S.
Really?
Yeah, because of higher pay and
Okay.
and so forth. But if you look at it from a longer-term perspective, that's not a minus for Korea. Because if you have a Korean student who's an AI expert and works for a top company in the Silicon Valley, and let's say, he becomes the next billionaire or whatever, the fact that he or she is able to bring in that knowledge to the U.S., it's going to come back.
Yeah.
It's going to be a positive boomerang for the ROK.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it's not a zero-sum game,
Yeah,
number
that's right.
one. And number two, I think people don't realize that, yes, soft power has limitations.
Yeah.
Korean soft power will not end the North Korean nuclear crisis. But if you look at how far and how much Korea has changed, culturally speaking, in terms of their familiarity with other cultures, openness to food, design, movies, and the list goes on, that's where I think a lot of Americans and Europeans find Korea so attractive.
Yeah.
So it is now becoming more of a two-way street.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, that's what makes our societies very strong. And I think that common glue can only come with greater human interaction. As elementary as that sounds, that's what makes our relationship very, very special. Because, 100 years ago, Darcie, as you know, since we're both Yonsei University graduates, it was founded by an American missionary.
Yes. Yeah.
And many Korean universities were founded by American or Canadian missionaries. Many of the Korean high schools were modeled after Japanese high schools because of the colonial experience.
Yeah.
But the university system in Korea is almost all American made. And I think that's another major difference between Korea and other Asian states, because the fingerprint of America's higher education is all over the Korean university
That's right.
ecosystem. And I think if we're able to build on that, that's another very small but powerful glue that holds Korea and the U.S. together.
Yeah. Maybe something that we could end our conversation on is then what are the lessons? Because I think that Korea offers a lot of lessons for the United States and for other countries that are seeking solutions to everything from education and economics, social issues, cultural issues. I mean, you remarked that Koreans are much more globalized in their tastes. And I've noticed that I moved to Korea for the first time in 2008.
Yeah.
And I've seen just even in that period of time, such a more, an openness to the world and a moving up the global value chain in so many different dimensions, right? Everything from industry to cultural products, technologies. So what do you think are the lessons that, Korea right now can offer other, let's say, mid-sized states?
That's a great question, Darcie. I think if somebody asked me how could I describe Korea in one sentence, I would say that Korea is the world's Rubik's Cube. If you look at Rubik's Cube, it has different shades and colors and whatever, right? But it has all of the negatives in the world today. Tanking population, falling birth rate, super fast aging society, deep political divide, existential security and defense threats, and the list goes on. At the same time, it has all of the world's positives. Really great innovation in industry, in soft power, in the fact that Koreans are becoming much more globalized in their interactions with other societies, the fact that Koreans are thinking about how can we as an advanced economy really pay forward to the global south, which we never thought about before, through aid or other types of assistance. So if you combine all of that into this one big jumble called the ROK, why is this a model for the world? Because nobody in the world has a model in the AI age. And I think one of the great lessons of Korea that could be applied to other societies is what I would call the bibimbap culture. It's the mixed bowl rice. Everything happens in Korea in a mixed fashion, and yet something positive comes out of this. And I believe that this mixed bowl kind of environment is where we're headed because China doesn't have the answer. US doesn't have the answer. Europe may not have the answer. So I'm not saying that Korea will have the answer, but at least as a laboratory, as a petri dish where all the things are like combusting and converging and colluding and so forth, something positive will come out. And I think that is something where both you and I, as Korea watchers, as long observers of the alliance, can really make that into something more concrete.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about going forward in the next few months. But I hope that in the next, after the politicals, we didn't talk too much about the current political situation. I think a lot of that's kind of contingent right now. But notwithstanding, I think for me something to learn is that the political institutions, with respect to accountability and anti-corruption, are very strong in South Korea, and that's something that I think right now across the world we can learn from.
From December 2024, when President Yoon declared martial law, and then within a few hours, the National Assembly rescinded it.
Exactly.
And he's paying the price both politically and legally and so forth, although the final judgment waits to be seen. In that interim, in the last several months, it may look like total chaos from the outside, but as someone living in Seoul at this time, the buses run on time, people go to work, factories are open, people are coming in for tourism. Everything looks kind of normal. And I think that's because, precisely as you said, the institutions basically are really resilient. And regardless of what happens politically, although that has a huge impact on society as a whole, the resilience of Korean institutions, I think, is one of the big dividends that we can see from this crisis that's ongoing.
Sounds like a good place for us to end on that positive note.
All right. As always, great to talk with you.
Likewise.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Thanks to the excellent Hyewon Park, who is our audio engineer and executive producer, and to Cameron Zotter, who is our videographer. I'm Sophia Besch, Senior Fellow in the Euro Program and host of the World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.